Howard Rotberg, it's a pleasure to meet you, author of The Ideological Path to Submission and What We Can Do About It. Welcome to Just Right.
Thank you very much for having me.
Perhaps we can start by delving a little bit into your background. What got you into being a book publisher, Mantua Books? What got you into writing books, The Ideological Path to Submission, Tolerism, and a couple of others? What's your background, Howard?
Well, I was born in the post-war baby boom generation, in 1951. And I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, a small town, Ontario. My mother had actually been born there. She was a child of Jewish immigrants who left Ukraine and Russia due to the very dangerous anti-Semitism that existed there, and left their families behind and tried Canada. And my mother came of age during the Second World War, but all the local fellows were in the war effort. The only ones that weren't fighting in the military were somehow disabled, and she didn't want a disabled one. So she met my father after the war, and he was a survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp as slave labor, at which camp his parents and his then 8-year-old sister were killed in the gas chambers. So I grew up as part of a family that had two different branches. One branch on my mother's side were born in Canada, and the other side were born in Poland and suffered tremendously. And as I was growing up, the amount of discussion about the Holocaust that we have today did not exist. There was very little written about the Holocaust when I was a high school student, for example. The only thing I could read about the Second World War was The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which really was a military book and didn't really say much about the Holocaust. So I entered university very much wanting to study history and to understand what happened. Why was nobody talking about it that much? Why didn't my father talk about it that much? And could I get some understanding of how average German people, who seemed to be not that different from average Canadian people when I met them after the war, how they could fall for this genocidal maniac and how they could decide to kill every Jew in existence, and how they in fact killed 1 million Jewish children. So it wasn't long before I found a professor who was teaching a course on European history and also one on ideologies. So by ideologies, we mean all of these words that end in ISM. Nationalism, fascism, totalitarianism, Nazism, progressivism, socialism, all of those things. And with that area of study, I learned so much, because I realized that if you have a certain ideology, you will look at facts such as how to treat Jews or how to treat Christians or Yazidis from the Middle East, how to treat them through this filter of your own values and your own concepts of interpreting the facts around you. So this was a great help to my own need to understand what had happened, and what they called in my family, what happened during the war. There was, until the time of the Eichmann trial in 1965 or thereabouts, there was no English word for Holocaust. In Hebrew, there was Shoah. So we didn't even have a word for it. It was called What Happened During the War. So all of these things really played on my mind. And after studying history for 3 years and standing first in the history department, because while everyone else was out going to bars, I was in the library full time, it was time for me to decide, did I want to go on to graduate work, or did I want to go to some professional program? And my father, who was a small businessman and loved Canada and was so happy with the way he'd been treated in Canada compared to Poland, and by Canadians compared to Nazis, he always wanted to encourage me to go to law. So I said, okay, let's give that a try. So I went to University of Toronto Law School, and which prides itself on being the law school in Canada. And I graduated, and I ended up practicing real estate law and development law and corporate law for 20 years. And after the 20 years, I realized that there was something missing from my life, that it was fine to do a good job on property acquisition so nobody would have a title problem, that the bank would be happy with the mortgage, and I could make a living for my family, which then included 2 children. But I decided that it was time for me to go on to do some things that would mean more to me personally in terms of my value system and my own ideology. So I started in on 2 things. One is I decided to become a socially just double bottom line real estate developer, which was right up my alley as a real estate lawyer. But what double bottom line development means is every project had to do some social justice in terms of providing housing, perhaps affordable housing for low-income working people, in converted heritage buildings to save them. And the other bottom line being that we had to make some money, less than other developers would want to, but we did that. So we did a lot of church conversions, warehouses, old fire halls, and I felt this was much more meaningful in that I was helping to house people who were the people you'd see every day and working behind the counter at Tim Hortons, but they were having trouble finding decent accommodation to suit their budget. Then, really with the situation in 9/11, although I was very much a supporter of Israel and very concerned about the current attempts to demonize the Jewish people again, and how the demonization had seemed to flow from the Germans through to Arabs like al-Husseini, who spent the war years with the Nazis in Germany and who planned to make another concentration camp in one of the Arab cities in Judea and Samaria. So I had seen some things coming that were a problem and was doing a lot of reading in my spare time. And sure enough, 9/11 hit. And 9/11, if you were at all a thoughtful person, would cause you to re-examine what was happening in the world and why America, which surely had a number of problems in its history, but was still a country that stood for freedom, with its constitution, with its values stemming from the Torah or the Old Testament. So we could see that the attacks on America were attacks on the notion of freedom, and that certain people around the world who hated freedom hated the United States and they hated Israel. And we began to see that of the 30 or 40 Muslim majority countries in the world, none of them wanted to have Jews in their countries. They were expelling them all. And that while the Arabs who had left Israel during the War of Independence were very vocal about saying how they were chased out of Israel, no matter if it was their own people asking them to leave or whoever it was, nobody was talking much about the thousands and thousands, in fact, probably equal number of Jews who were thrown out of the Arab countries, from Egypt, from Morocco, from Algeria, from Tunisia, Libya, all over. And as I began to look at it, even the so-called moderate Arab countries like Indonesia would permit Judaism to be practiced there, and would be very hard for Jews to enter Indonesia. Fast forward to the beginnings of the Obama era, we'll skip over the Bush years. And suddenly you had a supposedly hip, highly educated, supposedly black man who immediately upon being elected, as people thought they should be open-minded and give a black man a chance, although, as I'll say in a minute, he was not black. Black is more than just the color of your shade of your skin. He, upon being elected, he did several things which were bizarre in the extreme. Quickly got rid of the bust of Winston Churchill that the British had given there. He did an apology tour, the first thing. He went around to Muslim countries apologizing about what a terrible country America has been and how it took various actions in an imperialistic sort of way in terms of its history of slavery, these sort of things. And he actually said some things that are very, very bizarre for a student of American history, because he compared America's history of justice, individual liberty, and individual responsibility, and tolerance to the Muslim countries, which he said had the very same history of justice and tolerance.
You quote him in the book here.
Yes, I quote him several times, because this was shocking. More than just wrong, was it something that was wrong, it was shocking for an American to say that the Islamic majority countries, which none of whom have liberal democracies, that America had much in common, and this was an indication of a strange ideology and a denial of what terrorism was all about. That terrorism, as we say in the book, is meant to create such a fear in those who are terrorized that they will increase their tolerance for those who are doing the terrorist acts on the basis that, oh, they must be really hard done by if they're willing to do that kind of thing, not looking carefully at their texts, their television stations, their newspapers, their imams, all about how they're incited to take steps against the West, and how terrorism is seen as one of the best ways of dealing with the West. And with a president like Obama, the submission started very quickly. And we saw, for example, Major Dr. Hassan, the psychiatrist who became an Islamist. Let me pause there. I use the terms Islam and Islamism very differently. Islam is a religion. It has many problems in it relating to its growth in the 5th and 6th century and its use of violent conquest. And as many moderate Muslims today argue, there can be reforms made in Islam to make it compatible with liberal democracy. Many people deny that very vehemently and say that what's in Islam will never be changed, and it's a conquest, it's Sharia law, it's abuse of women, children, Jews, Christians, Yazidis. So we have a great difference of opinion. Is it just Islamism, an ideology that makes use of Islam for conquest and for abusing people and to gain power? Is that ideology what we're really concerned about, or is it the entire religion? And I tend to follow the great American writer and head of the Middle East Forum, Daniel Pipes, who says there's a difference between Islamism and Islam. And I follow my dear friend and fellow writer, who I published in Mantua Books, Professor Salim Mansour, who critiques fundamentalist Islam and promotes attempts to reform it and make it compatible with liberal democracy. I feel if we only talk about the evil of the various Muslim countries or the evil of the various Muslim dictators or imams, we back ourselves into a corner from which there's no escape. And that in itself, feeling that there's no escape, will tend to further our desire to submit to that which we can't change. And the book itself deals with many of the ideological paths that we're presently taking that are leading us into a submission to the most illiberal, intolerant people. But going back to Obama and Major Hassan, of course, became very radicalized. And the other doctors, the other psychiatrists in the military base where he was practicing psychiatry, all heard him say things which were very Islamist, very frightening, and ought to have been a great concern. But none of them stepped forward because it would have been Islamophobic.
Now, you're talking, of course, about Major Hassan. He is the major who did the terrorist act, the Workplace Violence Act, excuse me, in Texas a few years back.
You just put your finger on exactly the problem. He was a terrorist, okay, and he planned this terrorist attack in an American military base called Fort Hood, Texas. And it was a clear act of terrorism, and yet Obama, as you just referred to now, decided that he wouldn't call it a terrorist act. He also wouldn't use the term Islamic terrorism because that might hurt somebody's feelings, like the terrorists, or those who promote terrorism and tolerate the terrorists in their own countries, and even in this country won't speak out for some reason. But he then said, Obama, that this was not terrorism, this was workplace violence. This is submission. When you start altering your terms, the words you use for things, okay? Islamophobia is a good example. Islamophobia is not a real word. Phobia means an irrational fear. If somebody says to me, because of my writings, they look at me as Islamophobic, well, I would say that it's a rational fear of certain. For example, when Syria was going under and young Syrian men who were 18 or 21 were coming into other countries, if you were concerned about the real situation, reality, you're going to want to vet them very carefully to make sure that they were coming to make a new life for themselves in accordance with our liberal values and not coming here to shoot us all or behead us all and spread the growth of radical Islam into the West. Going back to the term Islamophobia, it has been used not so much as a shield against those who are biased against Muslims for no good reason, other than they're nativistic and xenophobic. Now they say that Trump is Islamophobic and xenophobic because he wanted to, as he promised in his election campaign, have a pause, not an end to Islamic migration, but a pause from 7 Islamic majority countries that had no functioning governments, like Somalia. And if they don't have a functioning government and you're asked to bring them into your country, there's nobody to write to or email to say what this person has done in the past. Has this person been a terrorist? Has he beat up women who didn't wear a hijab? Any of those questions can't be raised, because to do so would be to become Islamophobic. It's a nonsensical term, yet we have a motion in our government, M103, that says that in particular we've got to be careful not to be Islamophobic. And there's no definition for the term Islamophobic. As I've just said, it's a nonsense term. And what they're using it as a sword against liberal democracy, rather than a shield against themselves.
You're bringing us to the book, the point of your book now, The Ideological Path to Submission. You've covered ideology, which, by the way, you talk about in your book as something that is very difficult to get out of once you have an ideology. And how do we go from the ideology of Islamists to submission of Canadians, the Canadian government?
So what I'm attempting to do in the book, and you'll see from the book cover itself, if the book cover, it shows this house here of Tolerism, which takes me back to this book. So one ideology, and I'll go through some of these, maybe this is a good way to do it, that the ideology of Tolerism in my book, Tolerism, is meant to convey an excessive sense of tolerance towards those who are illiberal and intolerant. And the idea is that if we're endlessly tolerant towards those illiberal, intolerant people, if they eventually take over because of our tolerance, they will end all tolerance. And that's called the Popper paradox. Popper being Karl Popper, the great Austrian-British philosopher, who was very much a pacifist at the start of the Second World War. But as he saw the agenda and actions of the Nazis and others, he lost his pacifism, and he began to write about how far can we go with tolerance? What are the limits to tolerance? And this Professor Popper became a great interest of mine, and I realized that the ideology of Tolerism was not something that stems from our Judeo-Christian ethics, for example. Nowhere in the Torah does it say you have to be tolerant. You have to be justice shalt thou follow. It's justice and righteousness and proper interactions between people. All religions, to some extent, have an emphasis on being good. The problem with Islamism, it has taken Islam into a place of where they wanted to create a worldwide caliphate and have everyone else submit to illiberal values. But with most religions, we can see that we are intending to be really the religious life to be a good person. Okay, so for tolerance, if you're tolerism, it's going to conduce to not taking clear enough steps against those who are using our good nature and our liberal values and our laws against us. And we're starting, those who are most left liberal pride themselves on being good social workers or teachers or psychologists, are most susceptible to this tolerist nonsense. I'll give you just one example that comes from our education system. Our education system is submitting to Islamism faster than it's believable. One example, in Peel, where there's a lot of Muslim students in a school, they decided that every Friday, instead of having them leave school and go to the mosque with their families, they would allow them to have a room in the school to have their Muslim Friday prayers. One can argue whether a public system, which is supposed to be secular, should do that or not.
I understand, I think you may have mentioned it in the book, that they don't even do that in Muslim countries.
No. A lot of what we're asked to do is to evidence our submission. In fact, if you go back years ago about the hijab, the women's dress and the women's modest dress and the burqas and the niqabs, all of this, if you go back 30, 40 years ago, there weren't very many except really the most devout were wearing this. So now it's become a way, a style of dress which is to stand for a certain ideology, and that we must respect this ideology even though in our view of how women should be treated, it doesn't accord. It doesn't accord with that at all. Anyway, in this school in Peel County, not only did they allow them to have Friday prayers, but they allowed them to have an imam come in and preach to them in Arabic or Urdu. I'm not sure which one it is. And at one time they said to them, we want to vet what he's saying. And the parents and the imams said, I'm sorry, we don't believe in censoring the imam. So they backed down. So not only is he lecturing an imam there, and this is an imam who may well have grown up in an illiberal country like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, and may not have the same values, but in the attempt to be tolerant of Islam and even its most radical forms, because we don't ask them in Canada to do away with Islamism and only follow an Islam that's compatible with our values. In our contemporary world, with all of the stresses and anxieties that we have, even though we're modern and our technology has been put to use, we still have problems of depression and anxiety that seem to only grow, and they're growing amongst young people, and there's a lot of questions about the constant use of computers and violent video games and all of this sort of thing. And one of the things that I began to notice is that people who are stressed started to blame themselves or blame their own countries. So you look at the predominant history book in American education by Howard Zinn, is a book that's highly critical of America. Obama was highly critical of America. He went to a church where Reverend Wright said, "God damn America." His wife, Michelle, had the nerve to say, finally she can be proud of America because I elected her husband. In other words, she was never proud of America, although she used affirmative action to study at the best schools, become a lawyer, and get a cushy hospital administration job paying $400,000 a year. She hated the country, like Farrakhan hates the country, like Sharpton hates the country. So we see a kind of a masochism which then became mirrored in our own social sexual mores. I was appalled when I saw a best-selling book was about sexual sadomasochism, 50 Shades of Grey or something like that. And people on the internet were going on the internet looking for somebody, a woman who would whip the man. This is, to me, they're tied together. And I began to understand what was happening in Europe in a far different way than other people. The idea that Angela Merkel would let in 1 million unvetted, mainly male immigrants who come from what I call a culture of rape, where rape of a woman who's not honoring her parents or her family by doing what they say, or is dressing immodestly, or saying something that politically she shouldn't, it is okay to rape them, and it's okay to group rape them. Okay, so if we're going to welcome them in, is there somebody who's talking to them that you not only do you not rape women, but like the Muslim fellow, immigrant fellow in Edmonton who went into a swimming pool and inappropriately touched 6 girls in the swimming pool, is there somebody that's going to protect my daughters and granddaughters, I have 3 granddaughters now, from men who came from a culture of rape? And if one wants to see the culture of rape in action, there was an American CBS reporter, Lara something or other, who was covering riots in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood was being ejected in place of military who were a little more moderate than if you can say it that way, than the Islamists in the Muslim Brotherhood. She was raped by multiple men in the public setting. And this drove home to some of the journalists what they were really dealing with in these countries. So we are concerned that we're not anti-immigration, but there has to be some vetting. And Daniel Pipes writes about all the ways that one can vet immigrants so that they'll get a pretty good handle on whether they're coming here to join us in our endeavors or coming in here to kill us or terrorize us or force us to submit to illiberal values. The form of masochism also is reflected in something which I call cultural Stockholm syndrome. The cultural Stockholm syndrome we have is that the worse the Islamists are to us, the more we love them when we feel we have no choice. So for example, there was an American journalist who was captured and thrown in a cave by some Islamists in Egypt, I think it was. And again, when he was finally rescued, he came and said, these are very nice people. Sure, they made me stay face down in a cold, damp cave, and I was forced to convert to Islam, but they're really good people. So from a phenomenon that psychologists are interested in, we have taken this to the wider problem of Islamist terrorism against us, and that what one sees after 9/11, for example, John Chrétien's first words after 9/11 were not sympathy to all the Americans, of the 3,000 people, but we're going to make sure in Canada we don't take it out on the Muslims.
I remember as well that he also said that the Americans had themselves to blame.
Could be.
For it.
Could be. So the ones like Chrétien, or the ones who said immediately after a terrorist attack, we have to look at the root causes. The root causes, anyone who wants to look at the root causes should be sent to a Muslim country and let him live the root causes, because this is a self-hating idea. Masochistic cultural Stockholm syndrome, however you want to put it, it is blaming ourselves for the evil brought against us. And when we do that, that is an element of submission.
You say that in the book that sometimes we have too much freedom as an excuse for submission. Because we have too much freedom, people like to have their freedoms restricted.
Yes. This goes back to a social psychologist named Erich Fromm and his book, I think it's called The Fear of Freedom. So in many cases, people who are given too much freedom find it to be a source of great anxiety and fear. And they tend to embrace authoritarian or Islamist. Why, for example, would an English young woman or a French young woman or a German young woman go to Syria, volunteer for ISIS, let herself be given to a man who might hold her as one of three wives and abuse her if she doesn't like what she says, make her cover up? Why did women, after the American election, let themselves be organized in a protest march by Linda Sarsour, who's a very nasty Islamist woman who's been in the United States for some years now, but is very much opposed to traditional American liberalism. And there's something attractive to young people about radical Islam. We have to say it. 20 years ago on university campuses, you saw young men and women wrapping themselves in the Arab keffiyeh, which is a symbol for the Palestinians in many cases.
One of the things we get into our show about is the superficial treatment that many stories get. I wonder whether or not you could talk about the fact that the reason why we have such a superficial treatment is because all levels of broadcasting in the country, from the government to the media to the film and television industry, all of them have this ideological bent of submitting to Islamism. All of them have that. So where does the voice, a small voice like yourself, conservative voice, come out and shine a light on some of the underpinnings, the root causes of these things? How are you treated?
Chapter's bookstore stood by while a book clerk wearing a hijab was left in charge of a lecture I was giving, while two Arabs stood up and shouted me down while she was smiling and laughing about it. And one of them shouted, "You can't speak. If you're in favor of Israel, shut up." And the other ones, and people in the audience were saying, "No, quiet, quiet. You know, we came to hear him." And he turned around and said, "Him? He's an effing Jew." And he didn't use the real word. And anyway, Chapters didn't like how we handled the story, so it banned the book.
So book banning is how Chapters deals with any form of dissension or shining a light on issues that they disagree with.
No, they're going to disagree with that. They may even sue me for saying it, but I would welcome that. In fact, there were 7 copies of the book, and it was selling well, and they returned every single copy. They hadn't even paid for the book. There's another problem we have in our literary culture here in Canada. But they returned all the copies and said it wasn't available. One of their stores during the Hezbollah war against Israel didn't know there was a ban on it, ordered 30 copies. That was the Indigo store at Bay and Bloor, one of their best stores. And it was selling.
Which one of your books was this?
This was the novel, The Second Catastrophe. This goes back a few years. We were talking to somebody at Chapters, and we mentioned, well, we're glad to see you don't ban it anymore. And I was giving a lecture somewhere else, so we said this. So on a promo for that, we said, now available at Chapters Bay and Bloor. So people went in to buy it there. That was on a Saturday. Friday I was speaking to them at Chapters. Saturday I figured out what was going on, and Sunday was the lecture. And people Sunday morning went into Chapters, and we heard it's not there anymore. And the clerks at Chapters said, well, we'll give you something else better.
So add to the list that I just mentioned of government, courts, police, educators, film, TV. You can add to that book publishers and booksellers.
Yes.
Is that why you became a publisher yourself, a conservative publisher?
Absolutely, because I began to hear from well-respected people that they could no longer find a publisher for their work in Canada. And the United States has Encounter Books and WorldNet Daily, and they have a handful of very, very fine conservative publishers. But in Canada, there is not one. And some books are meant to be published in Canada, not the United States. And we have all of these media funds, and we have Canada Council, which all channel money to left liberal sources. We get no government support, nor we don't even try.
I think that's probably well, I wouldn't say it's part of the problem, but it's a value of conservatism that they don't seek handouts from government.
Yeah. However, with the understanding that I had that there was a need to get our viewpoints, which are classically liberal, after all. We're not far-right radical conservatives who have who want to do away with all governments, or again feel that anybody that's a Muslim is evil because he's a Muslim. I've talked about that.
You make it very clear in your book.
I think I'm very moderate. I think that I could bring people, bring people together. But obviously, the left liberals feel that any attempt to rain on their tolerist parade is a threat. Mm-hmm. So I'm treated like a threat. And with me, this is not. I'm also a practicing real estate developer of affordable housing, so I have something else in my life. If I only did this publishing, you'd have to film this in the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, because I just wouldn't be able to handle exactly what this country, to which I feel I've given a lot. I've been active in charities, I was president of my synagogue. I didn't feel anything incompatible between myself and my country that I'm Jewish, that my country somehow does. Now, however, I do. I discovered, and I have a chapter in the book called Islamification in Southern Ontario, that in the smaller Southern Ontario city, where I do my headquarters for my development, I've been able to watch how Christian mixed up clergy here have made as part of their Christianity Palestinianization of their religion, that helping the Palestinians is a key element of their religious preaching. And I've been able to look at various events that have happened here in this city, which are very, very problematic in terms of imams making statements against Israel. I had to watch during the last Gaza war, as our local newspaper promoted as wonderful people, a local couple. The woman was is a pharmacist at the hospital. Her husband was trained as a doctor in the Middle East somewhere. And during the Hamas war against the Israelis in Gaza, where they're firing all the rockets and for years and years against little towns on the Israeli side, finally Israel fought back, and of course were roundly condemned for fighting back. The world likes Jews that don't fight back, I guess. But in any event, he went back to Egypt, and he needed to, apparently, to keep his medical license in effect in Egypt, he needed to put in so many hours at a hospital so he wouldn't lose his license. So he went there to do that, and he took his 8-year-old daughter with him and parked her at his parents' house or siblings' house, where they got to watch the extreme anti-Jewish, pro-Hamas television that instructs children they should practice being soldiers for Allah against the Jews to rid our holy places of all the Jewish filth and that sort of thing. Anyway, he tried to get back to Canada, or he wanted to send the girl back to Canada. Okay, and at first it was very difficult for her to get back. So of course everyone was holding vigils, candlelight vigils, and this anti-Israel preacher or minister in the United Church was the big wheel in all of this. And what happened? The girl got back to Canada, which is good, but this minister was arrested for abusing young women in his church. And one has to wonder whether the immoral find that one way to deal with their immorality is to take it out on the Jews. And so in this little city that I'm talking about, I found many, many troubling instances. Although my mother grew up here Jewish, and she was a family of 6 children, and my mother and her sister lived in the city for many years, and my father and my uncle were in business here and were involved in many things, I no longer feel safe, and I no longer feel that we're wanted, and I feel that Justin Trudeau is part of his inclusive diversity. This is one of the most bizarre and awful things that I've seen since Justin Trudeau, who never finished university, has come into power here promising inclusive diversity. Well, would he have promised inclusive diversity with the Nazis? Would it have been good to have diversity of Nazis coming in if you assume that some of the radical Islamists are equal to Nazis in the terms of their murders and their rapes and that sort of thing? Again, I say not all Muslims, but the radical Islamists.
Isn't that, sorry to interrupt you, Howard, but isn't that more or less the gist or the crux of the issue, is distinguishing between a Muslim and an Islamist?
Yes.
And trying to figure out what percentage of Muslims are Islamists. And by Islamists, I mean purveyors of Sharia law, trying to overthrow the government, seditious speech,
Yes.
those kinds of things.
I have a chapter in my book called Islam and Islamism. It's based on the writings of Daniel Pipes. It's also based on the writings and conversations I've had with Professor Salim Mansour, with Rahel Reza, with the group Muslims Facing Tomorrow, with Dr. Jasser in the United States. I get a lot of flack from commenters on the internet. Oh, you don't understand, Mr. Rotberg. It comes from the religion, it comes from the Quran. Okay, it's never going to change. It's been this way for 1,400 years. They've been killing Jews for so long. What's the matter with you? And I say, yes, this is a very difficult thing to do. But unless we do it, we back ourselves in a corner. And unless we do it, we're going to be facing what Europe is facing today. And I look very carefully in the book at Sweden. And what they've done, they've become the second highest raping country after Lesotho in one of the states of South Africa. But Swedish women have the second highest rate of rape, and 93% are Asian men. So we have a big problem where some people feel there's no hope, other people feel there's no problem. So Justin Trudeau feels there's no problem. But more diversity we have, the better. And if I look at saying the diversity is coming at my personal risk and my grandchildren's risk, I'm not too pleased. And Justin Trudeau said, you know, tolerance is something nice, but we ought to go beyond tolerant. Every Canadian person who hears this program or who can tell somebody else that their prime minister says we must go beyond tolerant. Now, tolerance is being accepting of somebody who's doing you ill. Because the word tolerance refers to something that's unpleasant. You say, I tolerate pain. You don't tolerate pleasure. He can tolerate pain pretty well.
But it implies limits as well, doesn't it?
It implies there should be some limits, which we don't get from Justin. It implies more than just limits, that what is beyond tolerance? The only thing beyond tolerance is submission. So our prime minister, if you look at it carefully, as I've done in this book, has convinced me completely that he is submissive to Islam. His brother, Sasha Alexandra, has worked for the Iranian government, doing a propaganda film for Iran. Trudeau, and he's got people have infiltrated the Muslim Brotherhood. People have infiltrated the government, as they have in the United States in the security division. If we're not careful, if we think that they're all the same. How can they be all the same when you got Shia and Sunni? They're fighting each other in the middle. Iran is the Shia, okay, and Iraq, the big problem was between the Shia and the Sunni. And now in Yemen, again, it's between the Iranian-backed Shia rebels and the others. So there's a whole host of differences within Islam, and the only people who say that there aren't are people who criticize me or Daniel Pipes for being naive, or who follow the horrible prime minister for life, or president for life, Erdogan from Turkey. Turkey's an example of how a Muslim country, which was a democracy and was somewhat liberal.
And secular as well.
And secular, has only gone to be more radical and more Islamist, to the extent that Erdogan now has taken away all the powers. He got people to vote for him, that he has all the powers now. There's no more, the parliament just rubber stamps what he does. And he says, there's no Islam and Islamism. It's all Islam. There's only one thing, and I'm going to tell you what it is. All right. He had the nerve to go into Germany, which has a lot of Turkish immigrants. They brought them in 20 years ago or 30 years ago from Turkey. And he went in during the election that was for the purpose of deciding how much extra power he should get and whether he would have to be subject to term limits like a democratic leader would be. He went into Germany and he campaigned amongst the German Turks or the Turkish Germans, I don't know how you want to call it, but he obviously thinks they're still Turks and that he can go in and campaign there, and that's a big problem also. When it have a Muslim diaspora, who are they still viewing themselves as voting and living somewhere else? We had problems here with Lebanese who would come here until they got their papers, and they live most of the time in Lebanon, which of course is another horror story with that the Iranians have created with Iranian-backed Hezbollah against the traditional Sunni Muslims and the now depleted Maronite Christians, who are almost all gone now from Lebanon. So the idea that Muslims have any degree of tolerance themselves is negated for the fact that everywhere they go, they have harmed the other religions. Whether it's Bethlehem now has hardly any Christians because they were ethnically cleansed, and there it was by way of rape. They were raping Christian girls till the families said, that's enough already. I got my business here, but I'm leaving.
That's another value in a book like yours, in that it takes all of these issues and these events that are going on over the last many decades, puts them into one book, analyzes them, and assimilates them under a particular theme. In this case, the theme is going from a tolerant society, which many people may not think is a bad thing, until it becomes without a limit and into submission.
Yes.
That's the value of your book, and you ended off by saying, of course, the subtext and what one can do about it. Now, what can one do about it?
Okay. If I didn't think that we could do something about it, if I was not optimistic, I wouldn't be sitting here, number one. There's a good chance that I would have jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, especially when I was in San Francisco and saw how crazy they are over there. But there are things we can do about it. First of all, with these issues, as in all political big issues of the day, the starting place for our academics and our journalists all should be Israel. Because Israel is the first front in the Islamist war against the world. And they've had to deal with it. They've had to deal with wars that sought to exterminate them, not just wars over little territory, because they're willing to give them territory, but they don't want the territory, okay? If they do give them territory, it turns out like Gaza, where they use it to fire rockets against your children. So it's not a question of land for peace, it's peace for peace, and they don't want to do that. But Israel, I was there during the Second Intifada writing my book, my novel. And I saw, my daughter was there also. She was studying at Hebrew University in School for Foreign Students. And anyone in Israel, from the earliest times of cell phones, would carry a cell phone. Because unfortunately, terrorism is there. You want to know where your kids are. And if you hear there's a terrorist attack, you want to know they're okay. So I got a call one day from my daughter. I'm all right. Yeah, what happened? Well, they were just leaving the student residence on French Hill in Jerusalem, heading down to Rehov Jaffa Street, to go to the Sbarro Pizzeria with her and her friends. And they just heard the Sbarro Pizzeria blew up. So they missed it by 15 minutes. Okay. Very great tragedy. When I was there were attacks happening every day, because they didn't have a wall. They were walking across, and they were sending kids with suicide belts strapped around them. And the Israelis would see the kid. They weren't going to shoot a kid. They saw the kid, and the kid would go and get close to some soldiers or get close to some civilians, pull the thing, and blow himself up. All right. So Israel had to deal with this. And yes, when I was there, the people weren't going out much. They weren't going. The restaurants were a little bit empty, and in one of the central commercial squares, where there were a lot of tourist shops, they had signs in English in the windows: "Welcome, brave tourist." Special discount for brave tourists. So they made a joke of it, but the basic point I'm trying to make about it is that they eventually got over it. They get over the fact that, you know, somebody in their extended family could have been killed in either as a soldier or as a civilian in a terrorist attack. But they have what the academics call social resilience. And I go into this in some detail in the book about what is social resilience and how do you get it. Social resilience means you can adapt to the worst sort of things that happen, and you can rise above them, and you can carry on with daily life and not let it turn you away from being joyful, happy, loving, all the great things that exist in this world. That when they got all of those bombs and that, it did not destroy they have a high degree of patriotism. A lot of them came from countries where they were kicked out, whether it's Morocco. The Sephardic Jews came from North Africa. The Ashkenazi Jews, like my family would be, came from Europe or Russia. And they came where they could live as free Jews and nobody was killing them. Now people are killing them, but they say, we know the value of a Jewish state because someday France now, to be identifiably Jewish in France, is to invite an assault. Malmo, Sweden, which used to have a huge Jewish population, has none because the Muslim immigrants there were beating on the Jews. So the Jews of Israel know, better than we know in the diaspora, that Israel exists for all the world's Jews. That's why you can just go there where you don't have to apply for citizenship other than to say, I'm Jewish and I want to come here. They'll take you. You have no skills whatsoever. They took Ethiopian Jews when they found out there were Jews that had settled in Ethiopia, that had gone from the Middle East down to Ethiopia and had carried on their Jewish religion unbeknownst to the West for hundreds of years. They said, yeah, come on over. I don't care if you can't read or write.
So if Israel goes, so goes the West?
Absolutely.
So you must feel pretty good that Donald Trump moved the embassy for the United States to Jerusalem?
Absolutely. It was a law on the books, and it's just every president since they brought this law in said, you know, in an effort to reach out to the Palestinians and give them more reason to negotiate peace, we're going to not do this to them because they don't like it. You know, the Israelis themselves in 1967, after the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the Syrians and Lebanese all tried to wipe out Israel and kill all the Jewish people, when they went into the old city, which had been Jewish for thousands of years, and which had synagogues and whatever, that when 1948 came and they lost that to the Jordanians razed all the synagogues, they desecrated the gravestones there. And Israel, however, said, we're going to be tolerant. See that mosque that they put on top of our temple? Nobody would bat an eyelid if we destroyed it right now, because they committed acts of war against us, so we're entitled to do it. But the late Moshe Dayan, the general with the one eye, and it's a very bad mistake he made, he says, we're going to have to live together, so let them keep that.
He was tolerant.
He was tolerant. Because he was basically, even though a military man, he was a left liberal. Okay? And so we see the same things in Israel. So we can learn from, we have a book being published through Mantua Books called The Crack-Up of the Israeli Left by Mordechai Nissan, a former lecturer at Hebrew University and actually a native of Canada who was born in Montreal and moved as a teenager to Israel. So they have their left wing. But the main point of my book is that we can see the patriotism in Israel, the social resilience, that they're going to carry on and live a joyful life, and we have to learn from that. We don't have to submit. We got to get over this denialism. I talk in the book about denying reality is an easy thing to do when you're faced with anxiety-producing reality. But denialism is a whole set of ideologies and values based on denial. And when you deny something that's so clearly proven to be the fact, then when you are confronted with that fact, you look for somebody to blame. And who is it again? Yes, the people who are always persecuted by those who want looking for somebody to blame, the Jews.
When did Canada adopt diversity as a Canadian value? Because when I was growing up, I'd never heard that diversity was a value to be cherished in Canada.
Well, you can thank Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney. Suleiman Mansour wrote a wonderful book called Delectable Lie, A Liberal Repudiation of Multiculturalism, which shows why multiculturalism is a very, very bad idea. The worship of diversity, I say worship of diversity because it can't be called any other thing, because to say we think it's a good idea that evil people be amongst the good people, and if an immigrant's coming in, not all immigrants are evil, but there are evil people amongst the immigrants. Okay, but what Trudeau did, and it started from biculturalism, French and English. So he started in a good place. And then he went unknowingly. He was supposed to be so smart, but he then said multiculturalism, all cultures, and it became part of this postmodern nonsense. Okay, the idea of cultural relativism, that all cultures are equal, everybody is moral, we can't say we're any better than anybody else. It's absurd. Of course you are better than somebody who attacks little girls and rapes them. Of course you're better. How can you say that our basic value is inclusive diversity and cultural relativism and moral moral equivalency? Oh yes, the Hamas put its rockets in the middle of an apartment building and fired on Israel kindergartens till finally Israel had enough. They dropped flyers to warn the people to get out of this building because we have no alternative but to knock out this rocket installation. And sure enough, after they did that, the Hamas people held them against their will so that they could have more killed, so they could go to the Western media with their moral relativism and their postmodernism, who don't believe anybody's better than anybody else, and say, yes, it's a cycle of violence, and both sides are equally at fault for it. So this postmodernism, in my book, I'd go quite a bit into what was modernism, what was postmodernism, which postmodernism was based on this whole idea of relativism and equality of all cultures, and there's no right or no wrong, there's no good and there's no evil. And now I advocate a postmodernism, where we actually do reinstitute values, conservative values, faith and family and justice for all. Tabitha Correll is a great American writer, Korol, who's written about it, and I've quoted it in here. How the schools are now teaching diversity as the greatest and tolerance as the greatest values. The universities themselves have created an absolute travesty through their cultural relativism, through their sponsorship of hate fests like Israel Apartheid Week. I asked the University of Toronto, it was the first major university hosting it, and it's based on lies. It's based on lies, that it's somehow apartheid like it is in South Africa. If you go to a hospital there's a Muslim patient in one bed, a Jewish patient on the other, there's a Muslim doctor over here, the buses contain the same people. Okay.
They have Muslims as members of the Knesset.
Yes, and they have the Muslims who are in the army, they tend to be Druze. Okay, because mainstream Sunni and Shiite Muslims have decided they're at perpetual war, no matter that it hurts their own people the worst, and that their own people are spending their lives in jail, and they give them rewards, the families rewards, pensions, etc., if their kids are tolerant. But the Druze get along fine, they're doing very well. One summer I spent in a small town in northern Israel, and there was right behind it a grocery store that was a Druze-owned grocery store full of kosher foods, and it had the huge grocery store. It was as big as any Sobeys that I've seen, and better. It was Druze owned, and half the people shopping there were Jewish and half of them were Druze Muslim.
So it is a lie that there is an apartheid in Israel.
It's not only a lie, it's a despicable lie. Okay? Salim calls it a delectable lie that multiculturalism, that we should have multiculturalism. Going back to how it came here, when I went to school, what was the Canadian value? It was called peace, order, and good government. Peace, order, and good government. Okay, and I read into order the whole aspect of justice and liberal values.
And rule of law, perhaps?
And rule of law. And I became a lawyer, all right? So this impressed me, okay? And Pierre Trudeau started with the multiculturalism, and Brian Mulroney was in power when they actually took it from, made it part of the Canadian Constitution. This is the ruination of Canada. This fact that multiculturalism is considered to be our main value, when that holds that all cultures are equal, and that those who abuse women and children are equal to those who wouldn't touch a woman. Now even Justin's getting in trouble because apparently he touched a reporter who came to the fore now. It doesn't surprise me. The lack of morality in the Canada and the United States, the Weinsteins and the others.
So we've fallen quite a bit, I think, if we're tolerating such behavior.
We've fallen, and we're in danger of falling through the floor. All right. So this is why I'm doing this. And we're publishing these great authors. We have a book coming out soon by Farzana Hassan, columnist with the Toronto Sun, The Case Against Jihad. Here's a Pakistani Muslim woman who's setting out why you go back to the sources and you adjust the sources for modern life, why you can say that jihad is wrong. This is basic book. It should have been out there years ago. But when I heard that she was writing it, I said, we'll get it out for you, no problem. We have a problem, but as I say, I remain optimistic because there are increasing number of people on the internet who are running sites like yours. This gives me great hope. You are responsible for sending me home tonight feeling that there's hope, that we can get the word out to enough people, and that people will start to understand that Hillary Clinton, who said that what's important is respect and empathy. If I can just explain this. Hillary said we should respect even our enemy. Respect means that you're going to admire somebody for their achievements or their activities. And to respect Islamists who are beheading your people and raping your daughters, what is wrong with this woman? Okay, she said we also have to go and empathize with them. Empathy is a psychological construct, by the way, that's used by psychologists who want to get into the head of somebody else and see if they can cure them. And then it's bred to be a social psychological term, and that left liberal tolerist writers say that we should be empathetic. That's one of the main goals. We should have empathy. The key thing about empathy, it's only for those who are strongest in their own value system, strongest in their own ideologies. Because when you go and you get into that person's head and environment, it is only as if you are that person. You are not that person. You make sure that you don't become that person. It's only as if. That's the key thing about empathy. But for people like Hillary, they don't know where the boundaries are. And Hillary goes on at her speech at Georgetown University, which I write about. She goes on and on about these women from the Philippines who helped make peace between the Islamists and the Philistine government and this secessionist movement. Of course, they made peace by appeasing the Muslims and giving them control over the oil fields. That's how peace came, and that's how Hillary perceives empathy and respect and good deeds. Fortunately, the American people just went the other way.
By a hair's breadth.
By a hair's breadth. So although Mr. Trump can be a bit of a buffoon or a bully, we don't get sidetracked on that. What we get sidetracked on, what is he actually standing for? What is he actually doing? What kind of pride is he going to give back to the American people? Is it wrong to be patriotic? No. Being patriotic will give you the strength to overcome tolerism, overcome denialism, overcome masochism, overcome pacifism. I want to just mention pacifism. I grew up in a time in high school and university with Vietnam era. Everybody was pacifist. And still, when I went to Vancouver and I lived there for 7 years, everybody is pacifist. Okay, I got to tell you, this was like a huge problem for me. Am I warlike? No, I'm not a warlike person. I don't fight, never fight. I talk a lot, but I never fight. So why is this such a big problem for me? Because my father was imprisoned by the Nazis in a concentration camp and starved and worked almost to death, but when the Allies came through, even though he was down to 98 pounds, he survived. My then 8-year-old aunt, because she wasn't good for anything, was put in the gas chambers, and my dad's parents. So to me, pacifism in the face of Nazism, pacifism in the face of Islamism is immoral in the extreme. And for somebody to look at me and say, he's so wonderful because he's a pacifist, I look at that person and I feel you're going to ruin the entire history of the West. In the Bible, in the Torah, it says the Jews are always going to face somebody called Amalek. Amalek was a group of people who, during the Jews' journey from Egypt, where Moses got them released as slaves until they came to the Promised Land, Amalek would attack the weakest, oldest Jews at the back of the lineup of people going. And it said in the Torah that in every generation there'll be an Amalek, and we must be strong, and we must fight back, and we must kill them. Okay, so the pacifist left liberals say, that Torah is just as violent as the Quran. This is moral relativism. Okay, it's not. Okay, but people here don't have a good knowledge of history, of religion, of what happened during the Second World War. There's internet sites now where they go and interview students at University of California, and they ask them basic questions, and they have no clue. No clue. It's a great dumbing down. An education system and their emphasis on all of this tolerance and nonsense and inclusive diversity have failed to teach the most essential values of self-preservation and advancement of our great liberal nations. And this is a tragedy.
Thank you very much, Howard.
You're welcome.